I'm on a little book tour of California, completely organized by Cynthia Papermaster. I don't usually. I hold up my book at they're sold out, so I don't have one anymore. Oh, here we go. So I wrote this.
That's great.
I think it's too loud, isn't it? No. Let me also thank Code Pink and Berkeley Fellowship of Unitarian Universalists and KPFK and anybody else who helped promote this. I think most of us are friends, if not we're Facebook friends. I feel like I know almost everybody here. And I hardly have to come to Berkeley to tell people how to be activists. But a lot of what I'm dealing with here is more long-term, you know, because we have a majority against these wars and we can't get our government to listen to us and so forth. But when they launched these wars, they had a majority in support of them. On both Iraq and Afghanistan, we had a majority of the country that believed the lies, wanted to go in. You know, 3 years into the war in Iraq, you had an overwhelming majority of the troops serving in Iraq believing they were there for revenge for 9/11 and so forth. So there is a problem of this delayed reaction of seeing through the lies once we're into a war for several years and we've gotten fed up with it and some of the lies have been exposed. And we somehow need to get to the point where not just the people in this room, but a majority of the country spot the lies when they're told for the first time, immediately. And arguably we've been doing that for some years now with Iran, to our great credit. And obviously they are terrified that WikiLeaks and the potential for future WikiLeaks will make more difficult future lies to launch wars. But this is an educational project for those who love wars and for those who think, well, Iraq was a bad war, but Afghanistan's a good war, or, well, these wars all have problems, but World War II was glorious. You know, at some point, we're going to, if we survive long enough, we're going to arrive as a culture at the understanding that it is even more indecent to talk about accepting some wars than it is about talking about some slavery being okay or some torture being okay. You know, it's considered fair and balanced and reasonable to talk about some wars being bad and some wars being good, which is the most immoral, most destructive crime that our society continues to tolerate. We're going to get beyond that. So I think it's disheartening, at least when you see something like the Washington Post's reaction to their own printing of Richard Holbrooke's last words of "You've got to stop this war in Afghanistan." The Washington Post came out immediately with an explanation of how he was joking, which communicated quite clearly the idea that the Washington Post meant you to understand that they believed it went without saying, that they assumed that you would understand any such thing had to be a joke, right? While, of course, a majority of Americans want us to get out of Afghanistan. So that's what we're up against in the media. So I spoke to a number of people who were very intelligent, very informed, who told me that the Iraq War was unique. You know, never before had a president lied about a war. This was unique, right? And so I looked, I thought that sounded wrong. And I went back and looked at war after war after war after war, right? Other countries' wars, ancient wars, medieval wars, our wars, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that never happened, the lies about Pearl Harbor, the lies about the Lusitania that we knew had troops and weapons in it, the invasion of Mexico that we were told was an invasion by Mexico, and so forth. Every single war has lies that started, often multiple lies, mutually contradictory lies that appeal to different parts of the population, lies that keep it going, lies that replace lies that are exposed, and lies after the fact to beautify a war that had nothing to do with what was happening at that time. You know, so the Civil War was all about undoing slavery. The World War II was all about saving the Jews. You know, remember all those Uncle Sam wants you to save the Jews posters? And we tell each other all of these lies, including the fundamental underlying lies that keep the whole thing going, the possibility of a just war, that keep the war machine in place. So I thought it would be sort of an encyclopedia and endlessly repetitive if I went war by war. So I went with themes of types of lies and then pulled examples from a variety of wars. And just to give you an idea from the table of contents, these are chapters. Wars are not fought against evil. Wars are not launched in defense. Wars are not waged out of generosity. Wars are not unavoidable, etc. These are all major categories of lies, by which I mean not just specific claims of they shot a missile first, but propaganda in all its forms, including religious bigotry and racism and demonization of a different people that serve to motivate people to support a war. We have this, a lot of us were at the fence outside the White House yesterday, and it was snowing, and a guy named Elliot Adams, who's descended from a guy named Sam Adams, had a bicycle lock and locked his neck to the White House fence.
Oh my God.
A number of people chained themselves to this fence. Other people wrapped themselves around the fence. Over 130 people, mostly veterans for peace, but also groups that are here like Code Pink, were willing to be arrested for the crime of carrying the message of majority opinion about the war to the White House, while the president was inside with this review of the Afghan war. So here's a war where there's more violence now than last year. There's more death of all categories this year than last year. There's less support for the government and for the occupation this year than last year. There's more support for attacking us. There's more hostility. Everything you could look at is worse at greater expense. And here's a report on the progress, a review of the war. And it turns out that what's going to save us and fix all of this is 4 more years of the same thing, after which we'll relabel it a non-combat war. We'll have the combat combated by non-combat troops. And so that's what was inside the White House while we were outside. And to sort of skim through the themes of my book, the idea of evil as the motivation for going into Afghanistan was focused on this guy named Bin Laden, whom the Taliban was willing to turn over to be tried both before and after 9/11. And our White House had no interest in that. In fact, the president said not long after going into Afghanistan, I have no interest in him. He was an excuse for war, a wonderful excuse for war, a much better excuse than the communist threat. You know why?
Yes. Perpetual.
Racism.
Somebody said perpetual. The communist threat was capable of ending. Terrorism cannot end. Terrorism is defined as any resistance to the United States agenda. That's terrorism. And as long as the United States has an agenda, there will be terrorism. And the terrorist threat is eternal. It's indefinable. You can never prove that the handful of evil terrorists are gone from the world. Yep. It's a perfect propaganda for war. You know, this was a war launched by a crime, right? Instead of prosecution this time, we went with a war in response to a crime, the crimes of 9/11. We used revenge as grounds for a war, which is, of course, not legal grounds for a war in any way. It's not even a respectable emotion. It's a primitive reaction. And we built this idea that that could be grounds for a war on racism and religious bigotry and fear-mongering. I understand today we're supposed to duck and cover for nuclear attack again. They're talking about nuclear war just as they talked about nuclear war in 2002, which is the best way to scare people. And the best way to get people to think that crazy ideas make sense is to scare them. So the underlying lies included, the lie that a war can be legal, that a war based on revenge can be a legal thing, right? Which, in our society now where we are locking people up 23 hours a day without charging them with a crime, we're destroying organizations like Acorn without charging them with a crime, and Bush and Cheney and John Yoo and Jay Bybee are running around free, talking about their crimes on TV in some cases. We have a very vague idea of legality. And if the White House says it, as Nixon taught us, then it's legal. And the White House said, we're going to go fight a war for revenge, and the understanding was that that was legal. The underlying lies include the lies about war being targeted and surgical and clean. The fundamental lie that a war can be something better than anything else, right? That a war can cure something and not be worse than that something, which is just never true. War is always the very worst thing, so it can't be used to solve anything else. The idea that toughness would make us safer, right? All of this underlay that lie that we needed to go after bin Laden, which was then used for Iraq as well. And the only reason that people say that's the good war and Iraq is the bad war is that they picked a lie that couldn't be immediately exposed, right? Like not finding the weapons, right? In Iraq, they made the primary initial lie, there are all these weapons, and then they went in and didn't find the weapons, right? That was the mistake in propaganda terms. It's the only difference that makes Afghanistan the good war in people's minds. Then you have the lie about defense, right? We're going halfway around the globe to attack another impoverished nation out of defense. And people like the late Richard Holbrooke admitted repeatedly that this was built on a series of lies that could not be substantiated. The lie that Al-Qaeda being in Afghanistan would make us any less safe than Al-Qaeda being in dozens of other nations. The lie that the Taliban would put Al-Qaeda in power in Afghanistan. The lie that the Taliban would have complete power in Afghanistan, etc. It was all lies. And the same people, including Richard Holbrooke, would then turn around and push these same lies, even after admitting that they were lies. Then you have the lies about humanitarianism, which always tend to grow, often tend to grow after a war is launched on other grounds. And so we can't abandon the Iraqis, we can't abandon Afghanistan. We're in Afghanistan for the women. The women will be slaughtered if we don't stay and protect them in Afghanistan, which is a recipe for eternal war, and is a war that respects every right of those women and children except the right to stay alive and not have their limbs blown off and their roofs caved in and their doors blown open and their families shot in the middle of the night. We think of these violations of rights as justifiable because they're part of a war, and a war is a tool, even if we're using it as a tool to defend people's rights. It makes not the least bit of sense, and many Afghans and many women in Afghanistan and many organizations like the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan maintain quite convincingly that the post-occupation hell is going to be worse the longer the occupation lasts, because the occupation is destroying the country and breeding violence and breeding poverty and resentment and raising children in violence, and the sooner it ends, the better, in relative terms, the post-occupation period will be. On top of which, of course, we're there to spread democracy, and it's their country, and they want us the hell out. So there's a problem with the whole idea of humanitarian war. And then you have the lies about how we don't have much choice. It's just unavoidable. We're forced into it. It's a last resort. Nothing else we could do. War is part of human nature. It's in our genes. And so in the book I go to some length into, and we can talk about this if you want, into human history and prehistory and the obvious conclusion that it's not in our genes, and most human societies have done well without war, and human societies have gotten rid of war, and we do not need it. WikiLeaks, among many other things, revealed, yes, cheer for WikiLeaks, revealed the President of the European Union telling our country, we don't see any point in this war. It's hopeless, it's useless, it's not going anywhere, it can't succeed, but we're going to stay in it out of deference to the United States. You know?
Oh.
Bullshit. That's not deference to the United States, that's deference to Barack Obama. The United States doesn't want the European Union in that war, doesn't want us in that war. And so, thank you for WikiLeaks. The lies, then you have the lies of omission, the lies of not talking enough about the actual motives for a war that would turn off most war supporters. So there are endless sort of rational motives for wars, and in the case of Afghanistan, they include having bases, having weapons. They want nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. They can't resist that strategic location, and building a gas pipeline through Afghanistan. And these are things that are talked about openly. They're talked about in, Rand Corporation events on Capitol Hill. They're talked about occasionally on page 15 of the newspaper. Most of the real reasons for wars are not secret. They're just not repeated over and over again on the front page and on the television. All of the spreading democracy nonsense is on the front page. But the real reasons are hidden. And I went, in writing this book, I looked at all of the reasons that seem to really drive the wars, the stuff they talk about more than anything else in private, as opposed to in public. And there's overlap. There's some things that are completely public, support the troops, that you never hear in private. It's how can we get some Americans killed to drive this war forward. But there are other things that you hear about occasionally in public that are the focus of private discussions, the economic motives, the profiteering, the power, the placement of bases and weapons, and a lot of talk about domination and avoiding humiliation and controlling and holding off any potential rivals. And through these discussions where you see war planners talking about their decision to escalate a war, continue a war, and their need to decide on a reason why for themselves, right? Then deciding on a reason to tell the public is an additional step on top of that. You understand, you see in wars like Vietnam and like Afghanistan that they're predetermined to go to war and continue war and escalate war, knowing it's hopeless. And so I spent a good chunk of the book also looking at irrational drives that move these wars forward, because you just can't explain it rationally. There's too much emotion in it. You look at Congressman Peter King, who recently said that what WikiLeaks has done is worse than a military attack on the United States. And you start to understand what these people are afraid of, right? They're more afraid of Americans finding out what America's government does than of bombs falling on our cities, right? Presumably as long as they don't hit their house, and you can understand why. When you look at what's come out in WikiLeaks, and you have to sort of leave the New York Times and go look at The Guardian and go look at the blogs and dig a little, but we have a ground war in Pakistan documented and lied about. They have not acknowledged it, but it's in the cables. We have wars from the air in Pakistan and Yemen that those two governments have agreed with ours to lie to the world about. We have coups in places like Honduras that we're supporting and lying about. We have our embassy in Norway doing nothing for a year and a half but selling Lockheed Martin weapons to Norway. We have the bulk of our diplomatic staff around the world serving as assistant salesmen and women for American weapons companies. We have the White House putting intense pressure on Spain and Italy and Germany and England to block investigations and prosecutions of our war criminals and torturers. We have BP having experienced a similar blowout to the one in the Gulf of Mexico before, that our government knew about and didn't say anything about, that might have led to precautions that might have prevented that one. We have just endless exposures of major stories. And yet all you hear in the news is about the need to lynch the guy who put the stories out there. Right? Before we went to the White House yesterday, we went to the National Press Club, and we went with this group called Get Up, which is an online activist group in Australia. And they have collected hundreds of thousands of dollars and around 100,000 signatures, which is a huge, both of which figures are in the millions in US standards. I mean, there's only 20 million Australians in the world. And in support of WikiLeaks, and on a letter that they printed in the New York Times and the Washington Times full page yesterday, addressed to our president and our attorney general, saying, hey, what about laws? You know, you're punishing people without laws while the lawbreakers go free. And so we did a press conference, and we brought from our contingent Daniel Ellsberg from this part of the country, who said he would be here, but he was going to fly back today because he didn't know how long they'd keep him in jail. This was his 80th trip to the Slammer. Ray McGovern, who I know has spoken here, and Mike Ferner, who was the president of Veterans for Peace. And every single media outlet in the world was in the room, and they all had cameras. And not a single one of them had a clue what they were talking about. And they asked Ellsberg about these comparisons between himself and Julian Assange. And he said, wait a minute. Julian Assange is the New York Times. Bradley Manning is me.
Right.
You're criminalizing journalism. And if you try to do it for WikiLeaks and not the New York Times, you're going to fail. Yeah. This is insanity. And I don't know if they got it, but they listened to him for 30 minutes. I think, you know, when our president gave a speech from the Oval Office a couple months back about this pair of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, he ran through and supported and revitalized all the lies, starting with the weapons of mass destruction on through, and it was when he got to all the lies about the surge in Iraq, which I devote some space to in the book because it needs debunking. The lies about how this surge saved us in Iraq, how you have a war that's going nowhere, the thing to do is more of it, escalate the war and win it, which is completely false, right? Any trends toward less violence were long-standing, and they weren't in the areas where the surge happened, which didn't do any good, and so forth, and all the actual factors are not there in Afghanistan. But the President Obama used this to pivot to start talking about Afghanistan in a very Bushian maneuver, and then he started in, as they've been doing for years now, with the lies about progress and the possibility of success right around the corner, which they've always done for wars, right? This is, I mean, World War I, when the British cut off any news from Germany, we had to get all our news from Britain. They were gloriously winning every battle without much difficulty. You know, wars are always depicted for the folks back home in Britain, as well as for us, whom they wanted to get in with them, as successes. They're doing well, we're about to win. And that's true in Afghanistan, despite the fact that everybody knows it's hopeless. And so all of this happens on top of the big lies. The lies that we can survive this economically. The war economy is destroying us. The lie that we can survive it democratically, that we can have any civil liberties or any representation in our government with this militarism. The lies that we can survive it environmentally. Yes. You know, at some point, the environmental groups are going to have to take on the biggest destroyer of the environment. You know, and if that puts them on the outs with some Congress members or presidents, you know, so be it. We can't go on like this. The lie that we can survive the nuclear proliferation that's underway, the blowback that's underway, the global terrorist increase predictably through the global war on terrorism, we can't survive any of this. And so even if you could justify past wars, you couldn't justify war as a tool that can be used now. Because in this world, with these wars and this ecosystem and this economy, we can't survive it. We also have the lies that keep us home. Lies about powerlessness. You know, the Washington Post pretending that anybody would know it was a joke to say we should end a war. But if you look at George W. Bush's fine piece of literature that came out this year, you'll see that in 2006, the last moment in which the groups that bow down before the Democratic Party were lined up with the peace groups, we were that close to ending these wars. The Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who was denouncing as a traitor anyone who opposed the wars, went to George W. Bush and said, we've got to get the troops out of Iraq before the 2006 election. Right? They tell you you are absolutely powerless, even if you're an inch away. Right? And you have no way of knowing whether you're 10 miles yet to go or an inch away. And so you somehow have to just push ahead and understand that you are probably a lot closer than you think. I bet Kathy Kelly has spoken here too. You know Kathy Kelly?
Yes.
She sent me a letter a couple of days ago from Afghan youth peace volunteers and Afghans for Peace. Have you seen this letter?
No.
A few yeses. I want to read a chunk of it if you don't mind. It's not perfect English. In some ways I think it's an improvement on good English. But this is what the people whose nation we are occupying for their own benefit have to say for themselves. The people who are using non-violence to resist our occupation. We want you out. An open letter from the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers and Afghans for Peace. To all the leaders of our world, the leaders of the US-led coalition, the Afghan government, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and regional countries. We are intolerably angry. All our senses are hurting. Our women, our men, and yes, shame on you, our children are grieving. Your Afghan civilian military strategy is a murderous stench we smell, see, hear, and breathe. President Obama and all the elite players and people of the world, why? America's $250 million annual communications budget just to scream propaganda on this war of perceptions with its nauseating rhetoric, mimicked by Osama and other warlords, is powerless before the silent wailing of every anemic mother. We will no longer be passive prey to your disrespectful systems of oligarchic, plutocratic war against the people. Your systems feed the rich and powerful. They are glaringly unequal. They do not listen. They do not think. And worst, they do not care. We choose not to gluttonize with you. We choose not to be trained by you. We choose not to be pawned by you. We henceforth refuse every weapon you kill us with, every dollar you bait us with, and every lie you manipulate us with. We are not beasts. We are Afghans, Americans, Europeans, Asians, and global citizens. Yes, you have the false, self-appointed power to arrest us over expressing the public opinion of ordinary folk, students, farmers, shepherds, laborers, teachers, doctors, people who now have nowhere to turn and nowhere to hide. This world public opinion against the Afghan war has been clearly expressed and is larger than any number of WikiLeaks you seek to suppress. So come arrest us all as we civilly disobey you. Come arrest us all. Yes, you have the army, police, and apparatchik to smother us and to bribe those who are Pavlov-reflexed to money, but you cannot stop us from restoring our voice. We refuse to prostitute our hearts and minds. We refuse you. Not you, the human person, but you, the greedy system of self-interested power. Again and again, here in Afghanistan, we have seen a hope for non-violence light up. Every day we see a yearning for humane relationships, and because of this, Love is how we now firmly take our stand. How does trillion deficit killing followed by the strategy of escalated killing and yet another review for more killing work? How does it make anyone safer? How does it solve the incorruptible corruption, unequaled inequality, and inviolate violence we face daily? Your policies, skewedly diagnosed and reviewed in a cold, clinical manner divorced from reality, have been deaf to the concerns and needs of the people. Thus we endeavor to have a People's Afghanistan December review, because that's what ordinary people can do. We would try not to throw our shoes at you. We would try to recognize the better side of all human beings, and thus continue to serve our commoners tea and bread to one and all. But we do ask, plead, and demand that you stop your unsustainable superpower militarism. We want peace. We want you out. With singular sincerity, Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, Afghans for Peace. For a price, yeah. It should be. It should be. And maybe we should start a fund to raise for that. But I would rather see it used to fund good publications that don't launch wars. Even if they are magazines that we think the right-wingers don't read, if we fund them, more people will read them. They'll grow bigger. I disagree with almost everybody on this point. Everybody wants the ad in the New York Times, I understand. But I like supporting good media outlets. There's a radio station down the street doing a fundraiser right now. I want to take questions and discussion, but I just want to say a couple of words on what we can be doing. I think what Veterans for Peace did in Washington yesterday, what a bunch of you did in San Francisco yesterday, cuts through a lot of the talking and the whining about I've got an idea or I wish somebody had an idea. This is the idea. We need to set an example and show people and have others join in. I think that pushing these resolutions, that this city always leads the way, pushing, including on Bradley Manning, is the thing to do. A number of cities are doing resolutions now on the money, on here's how much money this city spends on these wars and here's what we want it spent on, that are directed to Congress. And I think even if Berkeley has done similar ones before, even if there's a line in the Manning resolution about the money, I think one of those would be very useful. And I think that, you know, this moment when they've turned the federal deficit into as evil a demon as Manuel Noriega or Saddam Hussein, it is when everybody across the political spectrum in DC, including the right-wing groups, are saying cut the military budget, is a time that we ought to be focused and pushing on cutting the military budget and working with all of the activist groups that are sometimes afraid to line up with the peace movement but have a need for money, because we can team up with them and say, here's where we don't want the money, here's where we do want the money, and try to force down Congress's throat what has become almost universal, even among the elites in Washington. I think we also have to continue to pursue accountability for the individual war makers, and that includes you and Bybee. 5 years ago, we launched After Downing Street, and we promoted awareness of the Downing Street memos, and we worked with John Conyers, who was the ranking minority member in the Judiciary Committee and was going to work wonders when he became chairman. And he held these unofficial hearings. And then he held official hearings for 4 years. In fact, he held one a couple of weeks ago on all the war crimes, all the torture, all the abuses. A guy who I'm sure has spoken here named Jeremy Scahill was one of the witnesses. And Jeremy said to Mr. Conyers, you know, one of the problems with the past 4 years of the Democrats having complete control of Congress is that you haven't enforced any subpoenas. You've destroyed the power of subpoena. For 2007, 2008, dozens of top officials subpoenaed who said, "No, I got to go golfing that day." And 2009, 2010, no enforcement, no reissuing. And Congressman Conyers said, "Oh, but we're holding this hearing, and I'm hearing this hearing. Isn't this good? Isn't this a start? Can't you praise me for yet another hearing, please?" And to his infinite credit, Jeremy said no. And I think, you know, at some point we're going to have to force action out of Congress. We can't keep flipping back and forth between rubber stamping the president when the two parties are aligned and crazy lunatic investigations when it's a Republican Congress and a Democratic White House, and a pretense of giving a damn when it's a Democratic Congress and a Republican or Democratic White House. So we have to find some combination where we force actual action, which is why, you know, I'm thrilled with everybody wanting to find an alternative president for 2 years from now. I think that's great. I'm 100% for it. But if our focus is going to be on a new savior in the White House, we're going to lose touch with the fact that what's going to make the biggest difference is the popular movement outside of Washington. And it's going to have to be directed more at the Congress than at the White House, no matter who we put in there. And so, you know, on the right, we have the Tea Party, and we have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we have the front groups for the corporations, and we have Fox News, and increasingly we have all the rest of the news. And on the left, we've got nothing like that, and we lump all of those people. We lump all of those people with the Republican Party, right? But they don't hold conferences where they talk about themselves as the Republican Party. They talk about how they can make the Republican Party even worse than it is, right? When you go to conferences with the left-leaning activist groups in Washington D.C., like I did last week at Roots Nation or Roots Camp. We had sessions with the title, "Why the Democrats Are Sucking," right? And everybody talked in the first person, "We the Democrats," right? And nobody in that room sucked, right? Because we don't have, yes, we have Veterans for Peace, we have Code Pink, we have groups that get it and are outside the two parties trying to move everything to the left, but they don't have the funding. And the groups that have the funding, like the labor movement, are subservient to the Democratic Party. And so one thing that somebody I work with has set up that we're hoping to build into the anti-Tea Party is called the Job Party. And you can go to jobparty.us where the agenda is creating 15 million jobs. And I recommend joining in that. But you know, we're in this for the long haul, and obviously I'm focused on educating people and getting people to read books and understand these things better, more than on what's going to save us by Tuesdays. So I thank you all very, very much for coming out here tonight. And any questions you've got about anything, let's talk about it.